It's Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Sam Park and John Ramey with you on Friday, October 20th, 2023, covering the week's biggest stories in economic and international news. United Auto Workers President Shawn Fain says the strike will go on. He is holding out for a better deal from the big three. There had been reports earlier this week that General Motors in particular was giving a lot of ground, but the strike will go on, although he did not announce in a speech today that the strike would expand. So they're just holding pat, but they are remaining on strike. Elections in Poland, and the hard right ruling party wins a plurality, the most votes, but it looks like they will not be able to form a coalition government. So the left and the center look well positioned to take over the government in Poland. And we will have the latest in the ongoing calamity in the Middle East with regard to the war between Hamas and Israel, new developments, and also the implications for who's getting on which side. It looks very different with the West and Europe mostly lining up with Israel, and then the global South, Russia and China, not commenting. Sam Park, let's start with your favorite character on working for Crusoe, United Auto Workers President Shawn Fain, who took to Facebook Live, the Working Man's Network, and addressed his membership about what is going to happen next in the strike.
Yes, actually, mainly what he did was to recap what had gone on so far. This was by far the most detailed presentation that President Fain has given throughout the strike. And viewers who would like to find out more about what he said today, I would highly encourage them to go onto the UAW YouTube channel, and they can see he went live on YouTube actually at the same time as he was on Facebook. But it's archived on their YouTube channel. The bulk of his presentation consisted of mainly a PowerPoint presentation, and there were about a half a dozen or so slides, each of which corresponded to a set of demands of the UAW. There was a slide for base pay. There was a slide for retirement benefits. There was a slide for cost of living adjustments, or COLA, as it's known in the jargon. In each one of these slides, there was a column. That is, there were 3 columns on each slide, one for each of the big three. And so he could explain to all the members exactly where negotiations stand in every category with each member of the big three. And it became clear very quickly that in just about every category, there are discrepancies amongst the offers that have been given to the UAW by the big three thus far. I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail about this. I would say that the general tone, however, that Fain had throughout the presentation really supported the impression that I was starting to get last week, that he might be feeling some pressure from the membership to bring the strike to an end. After all, nobody wants to be on strike. And the tactics that he's employed of standing up the strike gradually have been very effective, but they have the side effect that all the UAW members who are not yet on strike have to sit there wondering if they're going to be next to have to walk off the job and take reduced pay out of the strike fund instead of full pay for working. And so I really thought that Fain was feeling some pressure. He used rhetoric like, don't let them scare you, things like this. And again, I don't want to go too far into detail with it, but one thing he did say towards the end of the presentation was that it's at the end of negotiation processes that tactics start to get more hardball. And he talked about how the heads of the big three have been making public addresses about the strike and wanting to bring the strike to an end. And he addressed those comments, to offer a counterpoint. What he said seemed to jive with some of the independent commentary I've seen that seems to think that the strike might be entering or nearing at least its final stages, which would be good news for everybody, I think.
The strike began on September 15th, so we are over a month into the United Auto Workers unprecedented strike simultaneously against all three U.S. automakers, and they are, of course, Ford, General Motors, and the artist formerly known as Chrysler, now parent company called Stellantis.
Correct.
The report I read before Fain took to YouTube and Facebook Live came from the Associated Press about a prepared statement that GM put out saying it made an offer earlier today with substantial movement in all key areas, quote, and 23% increase over the existing hourly wage and a bunch of other, talking points that General Motors would want the public to think they're being very fair. In covering Fain's subsequent address to the membership, the Associated Press said that he spoke in characteristic sharp tones. So I don't know if that jives with how you found the address. And I thought that was just an interesting editorial comment by the AP.
Well, his tone, I think, it has remained consistent throughout. He does. That's just the way he speaks. But again, he went into much more detail about what they've achieved so far than he has in any of his previous addresses. And I mean a lot more detail. This whole PowerPoint slide, that was new. He'd never done that before.
So I have a question about the PowerPoint and about how he's comparing with what each of the big three is offering in specific areas. Is his explicit goal to get the same deal for his workers from all three?
I think so, yes. He hasn't said so, but he seemed to imply that very strongly in his address.
That was my question, because it is being implied, but to your knowledge and to my knowledge, he has not explicitly said that. It would make sense. It would make sense.
Well, the thing is, this, as we've said before, this is an unprecedented tactic in strikes, or in automotive strikes anyway, where he's striking all three. That is, the union is striking all three major automakers at the same time. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, in all of the earlier strike actions, the UAW would strike one company, reach an agreement with them, and the other two companies would sort of seemingly out of pure custom, right, just fall in line with whatever agreement had been reached by the one that had been struck. And so even if the strike is nearing its end, there's going to be some amount of work to be done to reconcile all the competing offers that the big three have come up with so far.
To Poland, where the Poles went to the polls on Sunday, October 15th, so 6 days ago. Per the Polish constitution, many countries, Sam, vote on weekends instead of on Tuesdays, when it might in fact be easier for people to vote. Imagine that.
Yes. Well, to be fair, we have moved a lot towards mail-in voting, right, to make things more convenient for our citizens. But yes, you're right. I mean,
the greatest country on earth could still actually make it more convenient.
Yes, I agree. I don't have any argument against that.
All right. So the polls went to the polls, and I have said it twice, and I won't do it again, but you can do it again, Sam.
I'm going to save that up.
Yeah. Seats in both the lower house and the Senate. So it's bicameral in Poland. And the lower house, the body has a name, SEJM. I am not sure how to pronounce that. Have you heard in reports how to pronounce that?
I have not.
Okay.
I would imagine it's same, but I don't.
Same would be my, again, I'm not a Polish literary scholar or language scholar, but yes, the same in the Senate were both had seats contested. So here's the deal. The ruling party, the Law and Justice Party, won 35% of the vote. That's the biggest plurality, but they're not going to be able to make a coalition because the opposition, the Civic Coalition, the Third Way, and the left combined for 54% of the vote. And it looks like that's going to be the three components of the coalition.
Yes, but as in many European-style parliamentary systems, the plurality winner gets the first crack at trying to form a government. So that's still where we are now. And so the expectation is that Law and Justice will fail to do so because their putative coalition partners still don't add up to a majority for that possible coalition. Whereas, as you've mentioned, Civic Coalition and their two possible coalition partners can easily get to a majority in Parliament.
Right. The snag for the would-be coalition, Civic Coalition, Third Way, and the left, is that the sympathies of the Polish president, the current president, Duda, lie with the far-right Law and Justice Party.
Yes, I think he was formerly a member of the party, if I'm not mistaken.
And they've been the ruling party since 2015. And the Law and Justice Party in Poland has taken Poland to as close as we might get without actually calling it an illiberal democracy, like we might term Turkey.
Or as Viktor Orban, he calls Hungary under his rule an illiberal democracy. He, in fact, uses that term.
And Law and Justice has brought Poland in that direction. They have all but made abortion illegal there. There are very restrictive laws regarding the LGBTQ community just non-Christian citizens in Poland. They have been very anti-immigrant, the Law and Justice Party, in their stance. So it is, I guess, a break for the good guys that they did not have a resounding victory, even though they got they got the largest plurality with 35% of the vote. One other stat we hear a lot about the reporting in this election for Poland was the turnout above 74%, the biggest turnout since the fall of communist rule in Poland in 1989.
That's right. And that, I think, really quickened the hearts of people on the pro-democracy side, right? Was that, especially in the wake of the elections in Slovakia a few weeks ago, which we've discussed, right? Slovakia is a very small country, but it's right next door to Poland. And like Poland, shares a border with Ukraine, has had the same sorts of disputes over grain exports that Poland is having on a much larger scale, of course, because Poland's a much larger country and has an enormous and very politically influential agricultural sector. And so there was a great fear among, especially in the European Union, that Poland might continue along the same lines that Slovakia had traveled. Slovakia is a slightly different case because the populist nationalist candidate there was not the incumbent, right? In this case, it was the more pro-European part, more liberal party that defeated the incumbent populist nationalist party. So the momentum was sort of opposite.
Right. Names to keep track of here. So you have Duda, the Polish president, who is sympathetic to the populist nationalist Law and Justice Party that has been ruling Poland since 2015. You have Donald Tusk. He is in charge of that civic coalition with the other two parties that could form the coalition. They seem to have.
And Civic Coalition would be far and away the largest party in that coalition were it to take the reins of the government.
Along with the left and the Third Way.
Exactly.
And then the third name you will hear is the Prime Minister Morawiecki, right? Yes. He has been the Prime Minister of the ruling Law and Justice Party since 2015. And this is his government that has really used media manipulation to engineer that climate of threat and hostility towards immigrants that we talked about, non-Christians. Yes. In fact, Morawiecki's father claimed in 2018 that Polish Jews entered the Warsaw Ghetto voluntarily and implied they had sympathy for Germans. I mean, just really kind of despicable stuff from the party that's been in charge of Poland since 2015.
That's correct.
You think about kind of where this watermark, high or low watermark, however you want to term it, comes internationally with populism. We've certainly dealt with it in the United States, nationalist populism. But it does line up a lot with how it kind of happened over here. I mean,
and that's, I think, that why the sighs of relief all across Europe really have been audible, right? People were really afraid that things would go again in the populist nationalist direction. And this was not just a record turnout, but a very bitter and hard-fought campaign. Civic Coalition and Law and Justice were really poles apart, and the rhetoric was just very heated all the way through. And there was, for instance, if we look at Donald Tusk, he'd already been prime minister under a previous government, what his party was then known as Civic Platform. I'm not sure exactly if they've changed it or if there's been a new translation style
Sure.
that they've requested or has been adopted. But anyway, it's essentially the same party. And he's nowhere near as old as Joe Biden, but there was the same sort of dynamic involved. It's like, really? This is the only guy you can get? You know, I mean, don't you have anybody else in your party? You had to go with the guy who's already been prime minister, but he wasn't prime minister for nothing, right? He's an effective candidate, and he did a very good job in rallying his voters to the polls.
Oh, very good, Sam. Just to zoom out a little bit more, Poland as a nationality goes back centuries, right? The language, the culture. But as a modern state, it's only really carved out after the end of the First World War. And they have been sitting astride all the turbulent history of Europe since then.
Yeah, so we discussed this in a previous episode, actually,
Yeah.
right? The different historical significances that Poland's had down through the years, all of them very large.
I mean, they're right in the hot seat, right? They're
Yes.
between Germany and Russia. And, you know, it's like we did talk about Slovakia, but it is like a big Slovakia. You don't want the country right next door to a belligerent authoritarian Russia becoming less liberal, less democratic. So
That's right. And up until a few months ago, they were, as we mentioned, some of the most stalwart supporters of Ukraine in their war against Russia. The aggression, the naked, genocidal aggression that the Russians have been inflicting on Ukraine, until Russia pulled out of the grain deal, and suddenly all this Ukrainian grain started traveling overland through Poland and Slovakia and other, neighboring European states. And suddenly law and justice turned on a dime. I mean, it was so abrupt because, as I say, the agricultural sector, as in many countries, not just Poland, right, is very influential. Poland has an enormous amount of farmers or farmland, I should say.
So explain that a little bit more. What I understand you're saying is all of a sudden Ukrainian grain starts pouring into Poland, devaluing a critical component of their domestic economy.
That's right. And a critical segment of the law and justice electorate. That
Right.
law and justice really didn't have any choice but to, suddenly start becoming almost virulently anti-Ukrainian just to mollify their agricultural base voters. And this, I think, might, and I'll leave this to people who know more about Polish politics than I do, but this might have actually alienated them amongst more sort of what we would call swing voters, right? Just like, oh, really? Suddenly, 1 minute you're super pro-Ukrainian and suddenly they're the worst, right? This just doesn't feel right. There was also the scandal, which I think we've discussed briefly, about
I wanted you to bring that up.
Policies, right?
So these guys are stalwart anti-immigrants, nasty language, and it turns out they're actually selling visas under the table.
Yes. In Asian and African countries, their consular officials were selling visas to nationals of those countries to allow them entry into Poland. And of course, Poland is a member of, I believe, of the Schengen Agreement, which allows travel across the European Union, not the entire Union, but most of the countries of the Union. So if you can get into one of the Schengen countries, you can travel anywhere in the European Union. And so the Poles figure, well, we can, or at least the corrupt consular officials figure, it's fine, we'll make some money, and these people probably won't stay in Poland anyway. They'd just as soon, we're right next door to Germany. They'd much rather go to Germany, which is a much more prosperous country. They're probably not going to stick around in Poland. Of course, some of them actually did. Because, depending on what country you're from, Poland is an economic paradise, for some people, depending on your own national origin.
And the rank hypocrisy of the Law and Justice Party, which is hardline anti-immigrant, and
Yes.
then it's their own diplomats who are basically being bribed for visas.
Yes, but I don't know exactly how much of an impact that particular issue had on the polling results. I expect we might find out, but this is still a live ball, as you say, right? Now, again, I don't want to be too hard on Andrzej Duda. In any European-style parliamentary system, the plurality party basically automatically gets, the first crack at forming a government. So if Duda says that Law and Justice gets that first crack, there's nothing at all irregular about that, actually. I think the question will arise is,
can they get any partners? Yeah.
Yeah. How long will he give them? Right. Will he make it something? Will he let them have such a long time to try and form a government that he's seen as standing in the way of allowing Civic Coalition and their partners to form the government instead?
And of course, there's no way Law and Justice would form a coalition with Civic Coalition.
No. I mean, so that would be unheard of in Polish political democratic culture, but that's a very young culture, right?
Sure.
Today, I think it's especially considering how bitter the rhetoric was in the election, I just can't see it actually happening, right? At some point down the road, sure, it could happen. I mean, Germany does that all the time, right? The Christian Democrats in Germany and the Social Democrats have had, I don't even know how many grand coalition governments they're
sure.
called. They're actually not all that grand, but that's what they're called.
Right, but the Christian Democrats in Germany have not been as hardline as Law and Justice in Poland.
No, they're not.
To the Middle East. Joe Biden visited Tel Aviv right after an explosion at a hospital in Gaza. Biden was supposed to then go to Jordan and meet with the Palestinian president and Jordanian leadership. That part of his trip got called off because this explosion at this Gaza hospital has somehow raised the temperature in an already tempestuous sea of outrage regarding the Hamas-Israel war that began on October 7th with Hamas atrocities against Israeli civilians. Biden said publicly that the explosion at the hospital was not due to an Israeli military strike, that it was a misfired Gaza missile. Israelis deny that it was an airstrike, but Israeli military officials have lied about that before. Also, Hamas does misfire their missiles. That has happened before, and they lie about that. And as I heard in an interview on The Intelligence, the Economist podcast, they said at this point, it doesn't even really matter what the truth is, because
I think that's the takeaway, actually.
In the Middle East, the main street in any Middle Eastern country that isn't Israel believes Israel committed an atrocity against civilians in a hospital. Even if it's not true, that's what's happened. And this has taken the whole thing to a different temperature boil now. Okay.
Yes, it has.
Which is unthinkable considering where we were last week.
First of all, if there was, thing is, it's not. That's where I have to take issue with this whole story, actually.
Sure.
Right?
Okay.
It's not at all unthinkable. First of all, the misfired rocket, as far as I can tell, most intelligence agencies attribute it not to Hamas, but to Islamic Jihad, right? Which is different.
But from Gaza.
That's right. Yeah. That is fired by one of the Palestinian militias inside Gaza.
Thank you for correcting me on that, because it's like maybe we might.
I'm not sure that actually matters, but just we're getting the details correct.
No, right? It does matter, and it also, we should understand, there is kind of a junior varsity Islamic militant militia in Gaza.
Yes, but at the same time, I don't know how many hairs we should try and split here. The fact is, Hamas itself is an Islamist terrorist organization. That is who they are. And so whether or not it was their rocket that misfired, apparently, and everyone concedes, that everyone who says it wasn't an Israeli airstrike says that it was a mistake, right? Which I find slightly interesting, not very interesting, right? But Palestinians say that Israelis targeted the hospital on purpose, right? Israelis say that Palestinians hit the hospital by accident.
Right. So it's not a Reichstag moment.
Right. They're willing to concede that the other side might have just made a mistake. Right. Now, again, I don't think that's all that important. It's noteworthy, but I think we can move on from it very swiftly. I would like to make a couple of points here. Is that first is that probably 200 to 300 Palestinians in Gaza died last night as a result of actual Israeli airstrikes. So whether or not Israel hit this particular hospital on this particular day shouldn't make any difference to any Palestinian or other Arab or anyone else who's angry about this, right? In fact, Israel is killing civilians in Gaza. That is what's happening, and they know that they are, right? For instance, they will always say, and they do say, and I think it might actually be true, that they do their best to not target, is the word they always use, Palestinian civilians. Just as the United States, during our incursions into Iraq and Afghanistan, said the exact same thing. We don't intentionally target civilians.
Right.
And even if that's true, and I think it might be, again, right? They're not doing it. There's no way they could do a good enough job of that. It's just not possible, right? It's, for instance, when we've spoken about the war in Ukraine, it's remarkable that conflict resembles conflicts that occurred 100 years ago, where you have just these fronts of soldiers facing off against each other. But even in Ukraine, civilians die in enormous numbers. And any war that we've seen in our lifetimes, and for a very long time before our lifetimes, civilians get caught in it. So the idea that these civilians who got killed at the hospital or anywhere else should take this to another level, well, maybe it does, but that was going to happen anyway. Civilians were going to be killed anyway, and in fact, they are being killed every day. And so if it wasn't that, it would have just been something else. And so I think that, for instance, the ground incursion by Israel into Gaza hasn't even begun. We're almost 2 weeks into this war. They haven't even started that. Now, I'm sure there are reasons why they haven't, and they're making plans. They, I'm sure, did not want to do it while Joe Biden was in Israel, or Chancellor Scholz of Germany, or Rishi Sunak of Great Britain. Probably don't want to roll the tanks in while those guys are visiting, right? But I'm sure there are other military considerations that are being weighed in their delay so far in launching the ground incursion. But once that starts, nobody's even going to be thinking about the hospital in Gaza.
Right.
It's going to get so much worse. And we already knew from the moment that Hamas busted into southern Israel that, as horrifying as that particular moment was, the whole thing was going to get worse. And so now it's getting worse, and we're surprised? No, I'm sorry. All right. A whole other level? Sure. But it was going to go to a whole other level anyway.
I mean, do you
still going to go to a whole other level?
So do you think Biden would have not been able to have that meeting with the Palestinian president and the Jordanian leadership the minute Hamas made their attack?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, we'll never know the answer to that question.
Sure.
I would say, though, that, and I don't know if it was because of Joe Biden, right? But originally, the Israelis were saying, we will allow humanitarian aid into Gaza only after you release the hostages. All of them, by the way. Israeli, foreign, whomever, right? Biden went to Israel, and after he left, suddenly aid will probably start going in pretty soon, and a couple of American hostages have already been freed. So now, I'm not saying that Biden should take credit for that. The point I want to make is that there is movement on that particular segment of this conflict. That's not anywhere near enough, but it's something.
We should point out what you're referring to is the humanitarian kind of corridor that they're trying to establish in Gaza, right?
Yes.
And that's supposed to happen in the next, as we tape this Friday afternoon, next 24 to 48 hours, I understand.
Yes. Hopefully it will. I hope that there won't be any hang up with that. There very well could be.
Gaza has had no electricity or water for the last 2 weeks.
That's right.
Or since this started. That's 13 days, right? I mean,
yes.
It's a humanitarian disaster before you think about the first, artillery shell or whatever.
Not only that, it's probably a war crime. All right. I'm not an international lawyer, right? But there's a very compelling case to say that it is a war crime. I don't want to start, having a legalistic argument about this. The point I want to make is that, as we said, we knew this was going to get worse, and so far it really is getting worse by far on a net basis.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken was also in Israel, and his speech with Netanyahu there seemed to kind of attempt to remind Israelis that they are a democracy, a liberal democracy, and that they're supposed to, I don't want to paraphrase his speech too much, but basically he said, look, we're a democracy. We're supposed to be the good guys, even when we're doing terrible things like prosecuting a war. He was essentially saying, you have to make an effort to not commit war crimes. You have to make an effort to not target civilians. That's what differentiates democracies in this world from the other guys. And I thought it was pretty bold of him to sit there and say that with Netanyahu right there.
And Biden reiterated that when he visited, and also in his speech from the Oval Office last night. I don't want to make too big a deal out of that. I think that, especially because Biden is a Democrat, right, and he'll be facing re-election next year, he has to say that to sort of appeal to the people on his own side who are concerned about things like this. I can tell you, I mean, I've seen a great deal of reporting on this in the past few days, that if Blinken and Biden said those things in order to try to appeal to public sentiment in the Arab and Muslim world, it's not working. But again, you have to at least try. But people just don't. And on the whole, I think, considering who Joe Biden is, the generation he comes from, he's just going to be generally more on the side of Israel than he is on the side of the Palestinians. I mean, I think he's tried to be as even-handed as he can be. But I think someone a little younger than him might have done a better job of that. I don't want to find a whole lot of fault with him. I think he's doing a very, very good job in general with managing this whole situation, which is, of course, an enormously difficult task.
Do we care that Putin and Xi got together in Beijing as part of a big gathering of like 140 countries regarding the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative this week, and they didn't condemn Hamas? Do we care? Is that important?
I would have wished they did, but I think it's probably too much to ask. I think that last year, Vladimir Putin fully revealed himself for the person he actually is, and that nobody can pretend he's anything different. And so it really shouldn't surprise anybody. Again, it's disappointing, but I don't think it really makes that big a difference in the grand scheme of things.
Does the international rules-based order that we hear talked about so much following the end of the Second World War exist, where we now have a China that has committed, crimes against humanity against a Uyghur population for decades now, where we have Russia violating the territorial integrity of another sovereign nation, where we have maybe war crimes from Israel, right, that will probably never be fully held to account given the circumstances of the context in which why they occurred. Are war crimes just like normalized now? Did we just enter into this new zone and the old, as I said, rules-based order has just gone away and nobody's really noticed until now?
I think that it's a fair question, and I would hesitate to try to answer it myself.
I'm not insane for asking that question, right?
Not at all. For instance, Israel has been routinely accused of violating the international rules. And the United States has seemed supremely reluctant to want to do anything about their violations of those rules. The United States itself has not always adhered to those same rules for that matter. One thing I would say, though, is that, for instance, John, you and I don't always follow every rule, right? And that's not what rules are for, right? Is that they should be universally adhered to, right? Is that they are mechanisms to regulate behavior. And so maybe that's splitting hairs. I could understand.
Well, I
why
think
that
there's a
might
difference
be.
between like stop sign, coming to a complete stop at a stop sign, right? I understand. Or maybe you don't put on your seatbelt until you get, into second gear or whatever, and a war crime, right? There are rules, and then there are
Yes,
rules.
that's right.
So,
And
yeah.
I think that we would do well to ask ourselves these questions. I should say, though, in uh, the public utterances of Secretary Blinken and Joe Biden, just to name two, so far, and I could be mistaken about this, but I have not heard either of them use the phrase rules-based international order, right? They've talked about democracy, tyranny, sovereignty, and things like this. They haven't gone so far as to talk about the actual rules of the order. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's probably on purpose because they understand that there's a lot of rule breaking to go around and they don't want to get sucked into that. I don't think they have any choice. I think they're we're asking this question now. Many other people are asking the same question also, as they ought to be.
All right, we've got 60 seconds. What are you looking at for next week?
Argentina. They're going to the polls this weekend. It could be a very consequential election for them. And Argentina is perennially economically troubled country, and that's the main issue in their election. So we'll see how that turns out, and we'll talk about that next week.
All right. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. Thanks for being with us. This has been Working for Crusoe. Questions, comments, suggestions, send them to johnrameymedia@gmail.com. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thanks, folks.